Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Stephen Rowe and today I have with me Miranda Schoombs, and today we'll be bringing you our case analysis on Ryanair, one of the most prominent airlines in all of Europe and the world. Bear with us, it's just us two, but we put in a lot of work and time and effort, so hopefully whoever's watching this, Professor Stan or any possible students, hopefully whoever's watching enjoys it. So I'll be going through the first part of the presentation and then Miranda will come in and finish up the second half. So starting things off with the executive summary. Ryanair's been in operations for over 3 decades now, for over 30 years, and they haven't always been as prosperous as they are today. Back in the day, they were just a small little airline that just took passengers on one route from Ireland to the UK. They're an Irish-based company. Um, with their current CEO, they went with a low-cost fare business model, and ever since they've done that, they've gone from pretty much unprofitable to now one of the most profitable airlines in the world. They're Europe's largest low-cost carrier and their second largest airport in general. And they continue to show continuous revenue generation and continuous growth with their profitability in a very tough industry. So going on with the introduction, they were founded in 1985 in Dublin, Ireland. Um, they started flights, as I said, just between Ireland and the UK, just that one route. Just 5 years later, they were unprofitable after immense financial loss in 1990. But 2 years later, their fortune started to change. When their current CEO, Michael O'Leary, came on, they decided that they were going to mimic another successful airline, and that was Southwest Airlines. More specifically, their low-cost business model. They were really the pioneers of this over in Europe, and they went from 745,000 passengers to now 73.5 million in just 2 decades. So that's incredible growth. They continue to show that growth, and in 2011, they CEO Leary talked about how they increased their profits by 20%, which is quite incredible. To do this, and I'll get into this later, that the airline industry is a very tough industry to be in. Uh, Revenues are hard to come by, so outside of just the fares, especially for a low-cost carrier, you have to find other ways to drive revenue, and for them, they do that through their ancillary fees. They're one of the best in the business at doing that. They only have the Boeing 737s. They order hundreds of these from Boeing, and they utilize an incentive system. This enables them to bring out tremendous customer service and quality while driving revenues every single year. Their pilots, about 37% of their total pay come from the incentive system, and the flight attendants, about 39% of their total pay comes from the same incentive system. So it's a way to drive revenues and keep tremendous service quality. Uh, Although Ryanair is the most complained about airline in Europe, but that's been shown to not slow their growth whatsoever, luckily for them. As far as those ancillary fees, they're top 5 in the world, and those revenues are increasing even faster than their passenger volume. So being able to compete with low fares is great, doesn't give them too much revenues, but being able to drive through these ancillary fees is what really powers their company into the prosperity that we see them. So that was just a little introduction. I'll get into an industry-based point of view, an institutional-based point of view, and then Miranda will come in and talk about Ryanair from a resource point of view as well as concluding the presentation. So from an industry point of view, not every industry is the same. Depending on where you are, depending on what industry you are in, your profitability just naturally is going to be very dependent on that industry. The airline industry is very tough, especially in Europe where it's highly competitive. Airlines just naturally are in a very low profitability industry, unlike soft drinks, which are high profits. But it speaks to Ryanair's capabilities and what they've been able to do because between 2001 and 2011, an entire decade, a recent decade, they were just one of 6 airlines in all of Europe that actually saw growth within that entire decade. So that's pretty incredible. Uh, because it's so competitive, they compete on virtually everything, the airlines, whether it be fares or time or service quality or of course, their own rewards programs. Um, they obviously pride themselves on the lowest fares, although that doesn't mean that they're the cheapest airline. They're the cheapest when it comes to fares, but depending on the type of traveler you are, depending on uh, where you're vacationing to, the things that you have to bring with you, your luggage, maybe golf clubs or skis, those ancillary fees can add up to the point where a traditional airline may just be more economical for some customers. So really, they target a niche target market of travelers who are just looking for the lowest way to get from one place to another. And when we analyze things from an industry point of view, we have to look at the five force framework. And all the stuff I just mentioned is within the first force that we're looking at, which is the rivalry between the competitors. Another force would be the threat of entrance, just like Ryanair in 1985 when they came in. Within the airline industry, they don't really worry about retaliation, as it's been shown with Ryanair and their publicity stunts and their questionable advertising methods. Unlike many industries, it's actually been shown that within the airline industry, a strong public image actually doesn't really correlate to a competitive advantage. And I mean, Ryanair's been uh, the poster child for this. Um, there was the EU-US Open Skies Agreement in 2008, where this allowed more US carriers to get involved in an already competitive market. So that just drove the competition even more and making the market share even harder to come by. Um, Another force to look after would be the bargaining power of the suppliers. Now, when it comes to Boeing, I would say Ryanair does a great job. They're such a big customer; they order hundreds of planes for them all the time, and Boeing couldn't afford to lose them as a customer. So I would say that Ryanair has a great bargaining power. They definitely have leverage on Boeing, but they do face significant cost pressures from other areas, specifically airports and air traffic control services. Those two are very monopolized in nature, so uh, they and many other airlines have a very difficult time having some leverage on that. Also, fuel prices have been increasing every year. They already have, and they still are. So they have to be well aware of the increasing fuel prices as it pertains to how they're able to drive their revenues and remain profitable going into the future. Another force would be threat of substitutes, especially within that region of the world, between the UK and Ireland and the continental Europe region, even Morocco. Traveling by sea actually may be more applicable and economical and convenient for some passengers. Not only cheaper, but more convenient. So they have to be wary of that as a threat of substitute. Also, as we move into the future, high-speed rail is becoming more and more prevalent. So uh, especially within that region. I would say traveling by sea, high-speed rail are definitely two main substitutes that they would have to try to fend off as we move into the future. Airline industry is already competitive enough. Service volatility is very low at the city level and very high at the route level. And those low-cost carriers, such as Ryanair, they mainly service Western Europe. So, from an industry point of view, it's extremely important that you look at where the company fits in with the five force framework, which we just did. Where do their strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats lie, and then find a way to best deal with that. Now, from an institutional based point of view, there's the formal and the informal. The formal would be the regulating bodies, the laws and the regulations and the rules, while the informal possible constraints or possible benefits would be the norms and the practices and the social aspect of that region. It's actually been shown that countries actually benefit from having low-cost carriers such as Ryanair because when tourists and travelers spend less money on fares, their purchasing power actually goes up, meaning that more money is spent in these countries wherever these airlines fly in and out of. The European Union's emission trading scheme, which was a piece of legislation, where in 2012 this increased by $1.4 billion, and by 2020 is expected to increase as high as $7 billion. And this piece of legislation pretty much says that airlines are responsible for the emissions that they put out there, and depending on how much they put out there, they have to pay money. So the more they put out, the more money that they have to spend, but they have to spend money regardless. Um, they're capped off at a certain point, but anything past that, they have to go out and get licenses and pay for it. Different regulatory agencies and bodies would worry about the environmental, safety, and different security measures associated with these regions. And it's actually been shown that airlines have been increasing their productivity while still remaining environmentally sensible. So even though it does cost them money to be environmentally sensible, at the same time, while they've been doing so, uh, the airlines have been increasing their productivity. They've seen the good and the bad when it comes to institutional framework, whether it be the formal, the informal. Um, Speaking from a formal point of view, uh, 2 years after they were virtually unprofitable in 1990, just 2 years later, the Council of Ministers really did them a favor, and if it wasn't for that, we probably wouldn't even see them where they are today. They definitely wouldn't be as profitable as they are today, if they would even still be around. But that pretty much said that anyone with roots in the EU, they could set fares, and even though that Ryanair was an Irish-based company, they're actually subject to both the EU and Irish regulations, which actually did them a huge favor back then. But at the same time, on the flip side, they hate the EU 261, which would make them compensate passengers for delayed flights, really delayed flights, canceled flights, and other circumstances where they would have to pay the passengers a certain fee, a certain cost for the inconvenience, where Ryanair calls it unfair and discriminatory, where they think that it should be privy to just the flight ticket cost. But here it could be even more, maybe substantially more in some cases. And that's actually what I have there on the bottom left corner, and that the big yellow picture, your passenger rights at hand, that's the EU 261. Uh, they hated it so much that even the Irish Department of Transportation, the DOT, enacted legislation to try to combat that. And it's been shown that the institutional environment can shape not only the employee but the union relations as well. So it's incredibly important from a formal and informal point of view. And also with their ad campaigns of not only O'Leary but Ryanair as a whole, they've been in hot water uh, for many years with their advertising. There was one in 2008 that they were accused of being misleading because they put up fares and a cost that were clearly excluding taxes and fees. Things like this get reported to the ASA, which is an independent ad regulator in the UK. They even had one with a woman in a bikini, which that alone caused them to get into heat. But then they advertised to go to a place in the sun, and a lot of these places hardly ever see sun, maybe 3 hours at the most a day. But it's just another day in the life for O'Leary. He's used to the publicity stunts, and it's been shown that in the airline business that any publicity is good publicity because apparently a good public image, a strong public image, doesn't actually correlate to a strong competitive advantage. And I guess they utilize that to their ability. Also, that Open Skies agreement that I mentioned earlier actually led the International Airlines Group to acquire BMI, which made it even harder for Ryanair and other airlines to compete on those short haul slots at certain airports, especially the top airports. So when it comes to institutional framework, they've seen the good and the bad. Um, if it wasn't for the formal regulating bodies, they might not even be here from 1992 with the Council of Ministers. But at the same time, there's a lot of other things like the EU 261 that they disapprove of, and then from an informal point of view with norms and practices and values and morals with their ad campaigns and the way that O'Leary speaks and carries his business, and he's been viewed as unethical at times, but at the same time he's been able to lead his company into great prosperity through many years, and they continue to do so every single year. So that was my portion of the project, and I'll turn it on to Miranda now. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me. My name is Miranda Schoombs, and I was Stephen's partner on this assignment, so I also contributed to the research. On top of that, like Stephen, I am also an MBA student here at FAU. 1 billion. That's the amount of passengers that Ryanair has carried since they first began in 1985. This year, Ryanair became the first airline to ever achieve this. And they don't even plan to stop there. By 2024, the company hopes to host 2 million passengers per year. So, today I'm going to go over how this is possible and how they're going to go about this. I'm also going to analyze the company from a resource-based view by taking a look at their financial, physical, technological, and HR capabilities. I will also be looking at some employee issues that they've had, and I'll be taking a look at what would happen if they offered free flights in perpetuity, which is something that the company has discussed doing. I will also look at some unethical practices that the company has had, and I will give my suggestions for the company. So let's begin. Financial resources. So, one way that Ryanair has built their financial resources is by following the Southwest Airlines model. So Southwest began serving small regional airports, and eventually they made enough money to grow to bigger ones. And this is exactly what has happened with Ryanair. They started in small airports, like small regional airports in small towns in Ireland, where typically airlines don't fly to and where many people aren't given a lot of airline options. So they started at those, and once they made enough money off of that and they built up their reputation, they were able to fly to bigger cities like Heathrow, Berlin, Brussels. So now, flying from small regional airports to these bigger cities, it's given Ryanair a lot more financial resources and more money. Overall, it's made the company more profitable. So now, the company has gotten to the point where they're profitable enough to have over 2,000 flights per day. They also have 86 bases and 205 destinations in 33 countries. Now, in terms of physical capabilities, this is one thing that Ryanair's financial resources have been able to give them. The money has been able to buy them 430 Boeing 737 aircrafts. It's also allowed them to order 240 more just this year, and Ryanair also boasts 13,000 pilots. And that's one way that Ryanair is able to fly to so many places, and it gives them the flexibility to add more flights if they want to. So this also is how Ryanair achieved the feat of having over 1 billion passengers. Now, in terms of technological capabilities, Ryanair got into the game pretty quickly. In 2000, they launched Europe's largest booking site. So this was a time when a lot of airlines didn't really try to pull people to their website. They were still trying to get people to make flights over the phone, so their website wasn't that accessible. Ryanair saw this as something that they could really launch into. So they made their site as accessible as possible and as user-friendly as possible, and it became Europe's largest booking site. So now Ryanair has had to become a bit more innovative. So this year they improved their My Ryanair customer accounts, which allows customers to easily book flights. And it's to the point where customers can book their flight in just 3 clicks. So also, Ryanair has worked with Boeing to have more seats on board. More seats means more passengers. So one thing that Ryanair has done is they've really tried to reduce the size of their seats so that they could fit as many as possible. As you can see in this photo, one thing that Ryanair did consider is the standing seat. They have yet to implement it, but it could be something that's coming in the future as Ryanair continues to adapt to new technology and to innovate as much as they can to hold as many passengers as possible. Human resources. So one thing that Ryanair does, which is different than many airlines, is they outsource their pilots. When they find pilots that they like, they make them independent contractors through a company called Brookfield Aviation International. So what that means is these pilots are working out of their own accounts and they're managing their own taxes, and it's as if they're running their own business. But what does this mean for Ryanair? Well, for Ryanair, it means that they'd get to save money. They don't have to pay these pilots for insurance, and they don't have to give them vacation costs. They get to really save a lot by outsourcing these pilots. So on top of that, flight attendants receive commission. So what that means is they're often pressured to sell ancillary items. They're pressured to sell you that soda on the plane, that sandwich, that candy. I mean, they're really pressured to do this so they can make as much money as possible. And while this might have been something that flight attendants enjoyed in the beginning, it's certainly starting to backfire on them. Flight attendants are starting to complain about this, and as you'll see in my next slide, one flight attendant actually wrote about it on the Irish Times. On top of that, flight attendants aren't happy because they're only getting paid for the hours in the air. What this means is they could be sitting at the airport for 3 hours waiting for a delayed flight, and they might only get paid for the 1 hour that they spend in the air. So as I mentioned, here is the quote from the flight attendant who wrote on the Telegraph, not the Irish Times. So she said, "Technically, we are not allowed to use the public address systems on the early morning or late night flights, but we are given no choice to use them because we have to sell products to passengers. And if we don't sell enough, we will be disciplined. We will be called to Dublin and forced to explain ourselves." So this really takes a look at how much these flight attendants are pressured to sell these items and how much they're pressured to make more money for Ryanair rather than just doing their jobs and looking out for the safety of passengers. And there are more employee issues on top of that. So pilots are starting to unionize. So basically in October 2017, 20,000 flights were canceled because Ryanair pilots were protesting. This made their shares go down. And now American Airlines is backing them up. American Airlines doesn't like what Ryanair is doing to their employees, and they want to help the pilots by helping them unionize and create a campaign to work against Ryanair. Now, with a lot of other cheap airlines coming into play, like WOW Air, EasyJet, Norwegian, Michael O'Leary, the CEO of Ryanair, is starting to feel the pressure. A few years ago, he mentioned offering free flights in perpetuity. And in 2016, O'Leary said this could happen in the next 10 years. How would this happen? And what would happen to make this a reality? So first of all, flight attendants would have more pressure to sell ancillary items. That's not necessarily a good thing, as we mentioned that already flight attendants aren't happy about needing to sell so many as it is. On top of that, Ryanair would probably develop more ancillary items to sell. So for example, right now Ryanair has created a rental car booking that you can go through them. So now they'll have to come up with more items like that. Maybe more deals with hotels, maybe deals with trains and buses to get the passengers to and from their destinations. Just anything that can make passengers pay more money to Ryanair. So also, Ryanair would make it a mission to get rid of air passenger duty tax. So right now there's a tax that Ryanair has to pay every time they fly into an airport. Ryanair would work with the government to try and get rid of that tax so they can make their free flights a reality. Also, they would share airport revenues, and this is specifically with small regional airports. So basically, when someone goes shopping in an airport, specifically at, say, a small town in Ireland, Ryanair would claim that those passengers are there because of their Ryanair flight. So Ryanair would try to take some of the money from the shop that the customer shopped at and get a percentage of that, as they feel like they're the ones leading the customer to their stores. Now, Ryanair is pretty realistic, and they note that this probably wouldn't happen at big airports. So at an airport like Heathrow, there are so many airlines flying into and out of the airport that there's no way to prove that Ryanair's customers are the ones who are making all of these shops money. Now, there are a lot of risks associated with giving out free tickets. So from the resource-based view, right now Ryanair has the reputation of being the cheapest airline, and if they gave out tickets for free, then this would most definitely hold. But Ryanair also can't ensure that costs won't increase. They can't ensure that the cost of oil won't go up or taxes won't go up. There's no way to prove this. Also, it probably wouldn't help their HR capabilities. As we mentioned, a lot of flight attendants are not happy with the fact that they have to sell so many items. So potentially we could be seeing more flight attendants and more pilots protesting. And that kind of goes into the fact that more employees would feel pressured to sell, and that there really wouldn't be any way around those sales, because that's what's generating profits for Ryanair. Now, from an industry-based view, they would lead in cost differentiation. The company wouldn't even have to focus on cost leadership at this point. They would be the ones completely leading because they would be giving out free tickets. But it would still mean that they would have to create more ancillary items to sell, and there's no guarantee that the customers will buy those items. So from an institutional-based view, there's also no way to ensure that governments won't increase taxes. And as we saw in 2010 with the EU-US Open Skies Agreement, now US companies could be flying in Europe. So that could potentially create some competition for Ryanair that they might not be able to keep up with. So also, providing such cheap free tickets would create a normative pillar for airlines to follow. So what happens if Norwegian decides to sell tickets for free? Well, Ryanair just lost their lead in the competition. Also, in terms of the cognitive pillar, that would be compromised, as employees wouldn't necessarily want to comply. Risks. There are a lot of risks associated with having free tickets in perpetuity. So one thing is, right now, ancillary items only make up 18% of operating revenues. Where else will Ryanair get the money to fund their operations, if not from the tickets and not from the ancillary revenues? Also, there's no guarantee that customers will spend more on food and other items. Now, a customer is probably way more likely to spend $10 more on their flight than they would $10 more on a soda. Also, if there's no guarantee that the airports could afford the deal. And on top of that, as I mentioned, other airlines will potentially follow. And then Ryanair doesn't have any sort of advantage. So we've also seen Ryanair exhibit some pretty unethical practices. So on top of reprimanding flight attendants for not selling ancillary items and not paying employees fair wages, they also charge 50 euros per boarding pass printed at the airport. That is 50 euros per passenger who does not print the pass at home. Now, on top of this, we've realized that Ryanair has had some issues accommodating people with disabilities. And it doesn't even seem like they have the capabilities to accommodate them. This was seen in a lawsuit in 2011 when a woman sued because her husband had to carry her on board because they didn't have the proper wheelchair accommodation. This was also seen again with passenger Niam Herbert, who is also in a wheelchair, and she had a member of staff approach her and ask her if she would be able to climb the stairs to the plane for easiness sake. Clearly, Ryanair doesn't have the capabilities to accommodate passengers with disabilities. Either that, or they're not consistent enough with their accommodations, which is also not acceptable because they should be able to accommodate everyone. So at this point, I have some suggestions for the company. One suggestion is to charge a more reasonable fee to print the boarding pass. 50 euros is extreme. But something more like 5 to 10 euros could possibly be more acceptable, and passengers might be more pleased with this. Also, the company should pay their employees more, even if that means increasing the cost of flights just a little bit. In addition, Ryanair should hire somebody to come in and teach employees how to help disabled passengers and maybe even come up with more accommodations to help them. So in conclusion, Ryanair has been extremely successful. They operate on cost leadership and they are one of the cheapest airlines around. But at the same time, they risk going out of business if no changes are made. Customers at this point are angry. Customers with disabilities have been disregarded. And at this point, also employees are angered by the way that they've been treated and how they're being paid. So Ryanair really needs to make some changes if they want to stay in business. And I think that making some of the changes that I suggested before could really help them and could help them potentially reach the 200 million passengers per year that they hope to in 2024. So I'd like to thank you for coming here today and thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed. References. More references. And the last page of references. Thank you.